Hello to this video call. I've never seen that form. I will do part 1 of the 25 November 17, 2022 of the public inquiry to the federal government for invoking the Emergency Act on February 2022. Today is November 18, 2022. I will do 2 parts. In the first part, I will talk about the first panel of 3 witnesses that were already related to the financial aspect of the funds frozen to the convoy protesters. The panel included these 3 people, Isabel, Michael, and Reese Mendez, and these are the official titles. And as we can imagine, the objective is to exaggerate the negative economic impact of the situation to justify freezing the accounts. We had the Commission Councillor, Gordon Cameron, that on the second day, he has been doing an excellent job consistently being persistent in trying to understand what is behind each one of these actions taken by these people. The same old story started again, that we're coming out of this situation, we're trying to reopen the economy. The USA was seen as very negative in the context of our reliability as a trading partner. And what we know is the NWO agenda, that the future of the auto industry are the electric vehicles, which we know is just a trap. And then they continue talking about the analysis of macroeconomic scenarios from February 10, a report that Reese Mendez did. And he talked about 3 different levels. The first one being the auto industry, that it was the most impacted in the sense that they work based on the just-in-time inventory. So they really need the parts to come in all the time on a regular basis because they don't hold any stock. And then on the second level, you have certain levels of manufacturing when they have certain level of inventory, so the impact is going to be slower. And finally, expansion of the closure of the borders that would go to other sectors, and he established that to be a very unlikely scenario. Then we talked with this entity, I can't even call him a gentleman, Michael. So the claim was that the objective of the measure that we're going to discuss during his testimony was to shorten the duration of the disruptions, to preserve the integrity of the Canadian financial system, and do it peacefully, he claims. And there were 2 tools. The first one was to use the Bank Act regarding the proceeds of crime, money laundering, and terrorist financing act, and also use the FinTrack system. Here is the definition. And the situation at the time was that FinTrack, that all it does is observe and report. They really are not enforcing anything. They just gather information, and the crowdfunding was not part of the regulatory perimeter. So obviously they couldn't even observe or report what was going on through these instruments. And that was enough cause to avoid a legislative process. So on the words of Michael, something fast needed to happen to minimize the economic impact. So doing anything via legislation would have taken time. Those were his words. So you can see how dangerous a statement like that is. So a rush justifies jumping the regular process. Interesting. This is a memo from Michael to Freeland, and you can see how highly redacted it is. And it talks about freezing the accounts, but we have no idea why so many words are being hidden from us. But obviously we know what that means. Here on February 9 was this memo, and then the next day an Ontario judge froze the GoFundMe under, quote, criminal code. So you can see how fast the pieces were moving, creating this storyline of criminal activities as part of the protesters. On a subsequent memo, they were presented 2 options. The first one was to create an authority to directly indicate to the banks that they had to freeze their accounts without any discretion from their end. And the second option was to create a list of names provided, in this case by the RCMP, and that allow the banks to use their discretion to freeze or not after what they would describe as a vetting process. It ended up being a hybrid between the 2, but that was part of this memo presented as part of Isabel's comments. The narrative was created obviously to fit the objective. So in her words, the situation seemed peaceful in the beginning, but started degenerating. So you can see where this is going. Without calling them criminals, they really can't end up freezing the accounts. The banks obviously were given two options, and the easiest one would be the one that we just talked about. And more complex was to allow them to have that power of discretion that we just disclosed. So they were in constant communication with the banks, with the CEOs of the banks, and obviously they were discussing how this would work. And something that is very interesting is that Michael, remember Michael's boss is Freeland. I went 3 times on the video to make sure that I was not mishearing. He said, Michael said, Mr. Freeland. I went and I listened to it 3 times. I would appreciate if somebody has the patience to just go and listen, because it's very odd. Why would he call Freeland Mr.? But he did. And he said, and Mr. Freeland joined me in in 1 or 2 of these calls. So how many calls were they, and why is he calling Freeland Mr.? So here we talk about the hybrid legal action that took place to freeze the accounts, the word that she used, that I was mentioning before. And obviously, here, the obligation was on the banks to determine whether or not to freeze. So it's very interesting how they pass the responsibility, and we're going to talk about that, because they continuously put the responsibility outside of themselves, even very likely in an algorithm, because the bank is not going to be able to go one by one. They were reporting something like 280 accounts. So this is the title of the video. This is the form that was given from the RCMP to the banks. And you can see here in the wording, you can stop the video if you want. Basically, you're telling, I am from the RCMP, and the following people are breaking the law. So what room for discretion was provided? Clearly none. So when Isabel was asked about the form, she said, I've never seen that form. So that's odd. Why wouldn't she? Wouldn't the RCMP approach them to see, this is how we're planning to implement the framework that you are giving us? So maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but you can see the disconnection between all the parties when you're talking about implications for a lot of people. And we're going to talk about specifics of those implications as well. Regarding the responsibility for freezing the accounts, Isabel said the decision was in accordance with the emergency order, but the financial institution was responsible for freezing. So the question was, what analysis did they do? And then the answer was, I'm not privy to the details of the operational steps. So we can see the trap. Once you set up the direction, but you don't even understand what is the responsibility, but instead you're washing your hands to make sure that it's not your fault, it's somebody else's fault. My favorite part of the whole examination was this part. If the government is saying, the commissioner counselor was asking, that these measures were the right thing to do, the Department of Finances we had no part on the enforcement on this, and the ones doing the enforcement say, we didn't write the law, who takes responsibility for the fact that these accounts were frozen, that people couldn't pay their rent, people couldn't buy their groceries? Who takes responsibility for that? And then Isabel responded, you have to understand that this moved very, very quickly. What does that mean? We're in a rush, therefore we just don't care? We're also dealing with evolving facts. What does that mean? So if the facts are evolving, shouldn't you evolve as well? It's just, again, a lot of wording destined to just release the responsibilities, not voice of reason. No, let's take a deep breath, let's step back, let's look at holistically what we're doing, let's try to have an adult conversation. Who tried to talk to the truckers, who talked to the government to have a different approach? It's all aggressive, and it's all trying to control and make this movement go away. Continue with the question. The commission counselor was asking, in your institutional report, you described, talking to Isabel, describe one of the purposes of the economic measures order as to dissuade the ongoing participation in the protest. Do you remember that? Yes. The minister deputy used the expression deter and disrupt. So we have the concept of deterrence from the RCMP and the concept of dissuasion from the Department of Finance, which is the same. And he was continuing, and then Michael interrupted, which is totally inappropriate. And he said, I think a better word for how we're thinking about this is to create a set of incentives to bring a peaceful ending to these disruptions. Their point had been made. And I'm thinking, first of all, what are you talking about incentives? Incentives, that is a threat. To remove your ability to pay your rent is not an incentive. It is a clear threat to your survival. And then their point had been made. Everybody uses this, okay, you already told me you are annoyed with the mandates. Can you please go home? Well, that's not enough, because obviously a lot of people and their livelihoods is in the line. If you choose not to put something in your body that the government is telling you, then you can't provide for your own family. So how fair is that? How democratic is this? So let's look at Michael's thought process, because again, he's the Deputy Minister, Department of Finance. He reports directly to Freeman. And in marketing, we have this expression that is called decision tree, that is the chain of thoughts that precedes a decision. And we typically use it to try to understand at what point do we introduce a concept to try to influence the decision of a person on purchase our product instead of another one. But let's apply it for this situation, because we can see this was what is happening on the ground. We had working men, we had families, we had kids, we had the majority of the nation saying, we're not happy with you. We were able to raise 30 million, and I say we because I actually donated a little bit of money. We're not happy, and we donated 30 million in few days. Remember that there is this comparison with the Liberal Party that raised less than 4 million in months. I think it was 3 months or something like that. So you can compare that. Obviously, at least almost 10 times bigger is the voice that is saying, we want to support freedom, as opposed to we want to support continuing being slaves. So that is the situation. The challenge, according to him, is to find a solution that is fast and peaceful. So his solution is to create a mechanism outside of the democratic legislation to freeze the ability of Canadians to survive with long-term consequences. We're going to talk about that in a minute. When you freeze these accounts, you're going to affect credit scores, and you're going to make sure that these people have a bad reputation in the industry of financing, thanks to those 2 or 3 days or maybe months, depending on each case. So it's not an option to talk to the protesters within the democratic system. So you can see how the solution is not peaceful, is not even democratic. So let's look at what a democratic system means, because it's a form of government on which and I dislike this word, supreme power. I don't believe anyone has supreme power over me, except perhaps God, is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation, usually involving periodic free elections. I find interesting that it says usually involving, so you can see how they're introducing already a permanent tyrannical system. But anyway, the point is that if you're not representing the people, then where is the democracy? And the answer is nowhere. A couple of interesting things. The first thing is that when I was looking into the Canadian government website, I looked at Freeman, and it says that she speaks Russian, Ukrainian, Italian, French, and English. She lives in Toronto. But the important part for me is French and English, I understand, because she's part of the government. She has to have the ability to communicate in the 2 official languages. Italian, I don't know, nor do I care. But why Russian first and why Ukrainian? Think about it. I have lived in Quebec for over 3 years, and even my French is not fantastic. So for a politician that requires a lot of precision in the language, you can imagine how difficult a conversation can be if I am not precise with another president of another country, or the Minister of Finance from another country. Obviously, I can't claim to speak a language if I'm not going to be precise. Why is this entity precise in Russian and Ukrainian? You can draw your own conclusions. And this entity, Michael, was promoted to this position in December of 2020. But if you go to the government website, the Department of Finance still has the previous gentleman, Paul Rochon, in the org chart. Why? 2 years and you can't update? You know how fast it is to just put this little picture and change this name? It takes literally less than 3 minutes. Why wouldn't it be already done? Think about it. I don't know. Now we continue with the cross-examination, Justice Center of Constitutional Freedoms. I really like this young man. He asks very few questions, but they're interesting. And he's not aggressive, so I really like the way he presents his different statements. And they were talking about the crowdfunding resources gathered via donations were not subject to the controlled by the legislation of crime, money laundering, and terrorism. So we talked about that. So new tools had to be developed to be able to do that. And remember that they claimed that it was done without time. So in short, the government had to do two things simultaneously. You had the legislation over the banks, but crowdfunding was outside of the scope. So they had to move crowdfunding into the framework of the legislation. And then the right to protest is allowed according to the charter. So originally, everybody was agreeing that it was a legal protest, but obviously you had to make it now a criminal activity, an illegal invasion, relabel it, just to be able to combine these two and exercise the power of the Emergency Act to make sure that everything takes place. And the only tool to make it outside of the democratic process was through the act. So now you can see, just because of these, you can control the opposition, and the opposition is not really opposition, it's the majority that is supposed to be able to express their will. And what they gain, that is very important, is increasing the power of the legislation over financial instruments that were outside of their scope. So very interesting implication. They couldn't direct the banks regarding freezing the accounts also until the act was enabled. Then we're talking with the counselor of the convoy organizers, and he directed his questions to Michael, and then he said, from February 10 to 14, were you informed that there were terrorists in the protest in Ottawa? We had no information either way. So you're going to notice that Michael is incapable of saying no. He's incapable of saying, no, I did not know. He just needs to be unable to assume any responsibility of understanding the implications of what he's doing. You were never informed that these individuals in Ottawa from Feb 10 to 14 were terrorists. We had no information either way. So you can see he's saying, no, I never received that information. He's not confirming or denying. And then the counselor said, then the answer is no. And then he got upset. He was aggressive, Michael, and said, I'm not going to give you a yes or no answer. What is that? Question, money laundering? I was not informed one way or the other. So he is choosing not to say no. These people were not terrorists, because obviously that means the scope of the legislation was overreaching. So FinTrack gathers information and gives it to authorities who inform and then enforce through somebody else. In this case, as we saw, the RCMP. The question was, the FinTrack legislation had no application to the protesters. And listen, this is exactly what he said. No, it did, maybe, I'm talking about Michael. I am misunderstanding your question. It did in the, it's just a mess, right? This man cannot answer a closed question. All he does is rumble and throw words to avoid the point. Michael was also questioned, can you admit that GoFund was set up to support a political cause? And this is important because political causes are protected by the charter. You are allowed, and everybody's allowed, in theory in this country, to have a freedom of expression. So when you are closing that avenue obviously it gets into a violation of the charter. So the answer was, as you know well, GoFundMe refused to continue to provide its platform for these funding activities. Obviously, they came to conclusions that made them uncomfortable from restricting from their platform. Well, that's not true. The government directly have admitted to sit down, I'm talking about the mayor of Ottawa, sit down with GoFundMe and tell them, listen, you're supporting terrorists, so you have to stop and freeze those accounts. So it was not on their own accord. I'm sure that they were exercising some political pressure to make that happen. Question, can you agree the donations were being used to support political cause? I am not going to judge. It's a political issue. You see? It's just unable. By January 25th, before arrival to Ottawa, 4.5 million were already raised. I didn't know that. I don't believe that. Question, donations to a political cause are interpreted and continue to be interpreted as freedom of expression as outlined on Section 2 of the Charter. There was no action to the activity of making the donations. What kind of answer is that? It's just very tough. Even this man did this face. What are you talking about? Regarding the cancellation of the truck insurance, your direction provided the option, this is from the counselor of the Civil Liberties Association, and Michael was also answering the question about if you did that, your direction provided the option to do it, but was never used by the RCMP. And the answer from Michael was yes, it could have been used, but was not used, so it's a perfect scenario. The perfect scenario? How? It's a threat. You don't use it. Well, how can you use it? Why are you going to support an illegal action by removing the insurance of the trucks that you want to move? Makes no sense. Question. Did you give some thought about the long-term effects on the credit history and scores on people by temporarily freezing accounts, even for a short term? The answer. But you're talking about people involved in unlawful activities. Yes, sure. Once you relabel, everything is okay. Here, the cross-examination also from the same counselor. The fact that the federal government could not reach provincial institutions was a significant limitation. There was a gap between the funds provided to a convoy and the funds provided for terrorism, because obviously they are not the same thing. So there is a document here that says that Savia, and Savia is Michael, and Jack, so that's Isabel, stated that there was a gap in the proceeds of crime, money laundering, and terrorist financing that did not apply to crowdfunding services and only certain service providers. So once again, they use this as an excuse to expand the scope of their ability to oversee all these financial institutions. Then it was the turn for the Canadian Constitution Foundation counselor. He and this institution protects the charter, and they were talking about the freezing of the accounts, and then the question was, would have been better to use humanitarian exceptions, and obviously they're talking about child support and other payments that are related to even medicine for certain people. And then the answer was, we could craft exceptions, and I do not disagree with you. I really dislike that expression. Either you agree or you disagree. The I do not disagree with you is such a political and very, again, irresponsible way of answering in my eyes. Question, credit history affects loans, credit cards, and some individuals with short periods of freezing had effects on credit scores, lingering effects. Should we have, or should you have done some thought in the long-term effects? Answer, but we're talking about people that were involved in unlawful activities. You see, they just run with that line consistently, and then it doesn't matter. Whatever we do is totally fine, because these were unlawful activities and criminal activities. And then the counselor said, but that is not true. You just said donors. And then they contradicted and said, no, they were not donors. You can see they just make it up as they go. This is an issue for the financial institutions, not for the government of Canada. Excuse me? You just directed the banks to do something. You're forcing them with official paperwork from the RCMP, the highest level of policing in the federal institution, and you're telling them that is their problem? How? In brief, the illegal activity storyline justified anything and everything done against the protesters, and the government titles given to these entitled entities protect them from any consequence for their actions. And even now, with calm observation after time lapsed, there's no remorse, there's no conscience that appear to be active on or in any of them. This is the end of part one. Part two, for the second witness, Jody Thomas, National Security Advisor to Trudeau. I will do that tomorrow. I haven't listened to that testimony, so thank you very much for listening.